Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast Live. If it's noon Eastern time on Monday, then chances are this is where you're going to find me. Let me ask you a couple questions. Have you ever been stuck? Would you like to have greater fulfillment at work? And as a leader, would you like to be able to create and more fulfillment and happiness for your team? Well, if that sounds like a good idea to you, and it should, you're in the right place. Again, this is another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're listening later, you can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us like people who are here interacting with us live. And you can also see these sooner. This is several months ahead live of when this will be on the podcast. You can join our LinkedIn or Facebook groups as well. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook. or remarkable.com/LinkedIn. But if you're here live, I want you to imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. So share your questions, your comments, and your ideas. They'll make for a better conversation and eventually for a better podcast episode as well. Today's episode is brought to you by the Remarkable Leadership Masterclasses. Each month we release a new skill. We released one this morning in an advanced masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or to get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now I want to introduce you to our guest today. Her name is, there she is. Hello, Beverly. Beverly Jones is our guest, and she works with leaders to spark engagement and productivity in their teams and helps professionals to thrive in their careers. Her work focuses on building resilience, enhancing performance, managing time and energy, improving communication, and navigating transitions. Like there's something on that list that you need. I'm just saying. Bev's clients include leaders in businesses of all sizes, in universities and government agencies. She is a visiting fellow at the Boyanovich School of Leadership and Public Service at Ohio University, her alma mater. More on that in a second. Her new book, Find Your Happy at Work, is a roadmap for finding joy, meaning, and success at work, and at the same time, motivating your team. Her book on career resilience, Think Like an Entrepreneur, Act Like a CEO, is available around the world. Her NPR.org podcast, Jazzed About Work, features conversations and stories related to careers and leadership. She has a BS in journalism and an MBA from Ohio University and a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center. Beverly, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Thanks for joining me.
I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much for that long introduction. I'm honored.
I think it's the one your mom wrote.
Probably.
But listen, I'm so glad. So for those of you that are with us live, just comments are starting to come in. Just say hello. Tell us where you're from. There we go. Greetings from Beverly Hills. We'll just put that right up there so people can see, and that will encourage others to do the same. Thank you, Cherie. So Beverly, I want to start, when I introduce people, it gives people a bit of a clue into their journey, into their path, but not really as much as I think is interesting. And so I'd like you to just tell us just briefly a little bit about your journey. Like you didn't wake up when you were 8 and say, I'm going to write books about careers.
No, but I started kind of early and went back and forth focusing on these issues. Back at Ohio University when I was a young journalism student and I worked at the radio station and the newspaper and I did all those things, I was very frustrated about the limited opportunities for women. There are all kinds of programs in those days that didn't accept women or only limited them to like 3%. So I started kind of being an activist. And then when I was working on my MBA there, and I was the first woman in the MBA program, the president of the university hired me first to spend a year writing a report on the status of women, and then made me his assistant for opening doors, educational and professional doors for women and people of color and anybody who hadn't had a chance in the past. So that's what I did in my 20s before law school. And it's always kind of been my thing. How can people do the things they really want and make the contribution they're capable of? And I lost track of the passion from time to time. As a young lawyer, I was just as narrow-minded as every other young lawyer seems to be, but that's where I began.
Well, we won't go down that path. We'll leave that for another show on another day. For this. Because you wrote a book, Beverly, called Find Your Happy at Work. And there's at least two things in that statement that some people might be scratching their head about. There's the happy at work part, but I'd like to start with the first part, which is, can we actually find happy?
Absolutely. It used to be thought, science thought, that if you were born a pessimist, if you were born a grouch, that was it. There wasn't much you could do. But now, of course, with the positive psychology movement and so much research, we know that you have perhaps a set point of level of happiness, but you can change that. There are so many things to do. And I'm a person who was born I think, a pessimist and a worrier. And really, I had to learn the hard way. I could either be miserable or I could make choices to be something else. And so a lot of the things that I'm writing about are things that I'm reminding myself of, or I'm talking to the young version of me.
That's such an interesting thing, because as I talk to lots of authors, of course, on this show, and friends and colleagues as well. And I feel the same way, that a lot of times when I'm writing, whether I'm writing a book or a blog post, it feels like, okay, I'm writing this for me, and maybe someone else benefits too. So I really love that. The subtitle of the book, which I don't think was in that wonderful introduction that I gave you,
No.
It says 50 ways to get unstuck, move past boredom, and discover fulfillment. So 50 ways, everybody. So in this book, there are 50 different ideas, and we're going to get into those. And I want to talk about this on a personal level. And then before we finish, we'll come back and talk about it from a leadership perspective as well. How does that sound? That work for you?
Sounds great.
So what I thought I would do is I would pick a couple, and we could just chat about those. And if anyone who's with us live has a question about finding your happy, or about any of the stuff as we start to talk about it, feel free to ask. But we'll start with sort of a couple that I had that I wanted us to chat about, then let you pick one or two, and then we'll talk about leadership. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Cool. So the first one that I have on my list, there's two or three of the 50 things that relate to our calendars. So why don't you just talk about our calendars and our happiness? Because I think the stuff that you share there is first of all, some of it I practice as well. So that obviously means I agree. But beyond that, I think it's extremely practical. And not everyone looks at their calendar and starts smiling, right? So talk about how we can use our calendars better.
Well, I have clients who are very busy and lots of meetings, and many times they feel like their calendar is the enemy. They have other people putting things on the schedule. They can barely deal with it. And so they tend to be in one of two modes. They're either following it slavishly and doing a lot of things that maybe aren't the best use of their time, or they're ignoring it and getting totally off course. So one of my points is, stop thinking of your schedule, your calendar, as a list of meetings. It's much more than that. It's really, this is the lawyer in me. It's really a contract with yourself. It's a way to look ahead and decide, how should I spend my time? And that means a few things, not just what projects you want to work on, but where are you going to build in the breaks? Where is the most high profile, the high potential real estate on your calendar? For me, it's like this time or earlier. I do better in the morning. So for some people, knowing when their brains are the sharpest, that's when they want to do their deep work. They want to write their important reports. When do you feel like you need to talk to people? Maybe at lunchtime. So it's about knowing yourself, knowing your priorities, and forming intentions, putting them on the calendar. And then the next step is making a commitment to make that calendar your friend and not your enemy.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else right there, which is making the commitment that once you put it on the calendar, like the time to work on your deep work, right, that you keep it on your calendar. Because,
absolutely.
Beverly, I've asked hundreds of people this question. So have you ever blocked time in your calendar to work on something important? And, 85% of people will say yes. And so for the other 15%, they're saying, wow, that's a great idea. Never thought of it. But for 85%-ish of people, they say, yeah, I've done that. And I said, okay, how many of you have, after you put it on the calendar and someone asks you for a meeting, you say, well, yeah, I'm available.
Yeah.
About 85% of the 85%, right?
We all do it. And I think most people do what I do, is we're good for a while, and then we sort of lose focus, and then we have to pull ourselves up again. But there's some things you can manage yourself. I am a dog lover and I kind of enjoy dog training. And sometimes when I'm managing myself about things like that, I think it's just like dog training. You need to build in a very clear directive and some positive reinforcement. For a lot of people, tracking works. That is, not just putting it on the calendar, but giving yourself a star, making a note, finding a way to reiterate what you've done, writing a few comments at the end of the day, kind of giving yourself an assessment of the day. So managing yourself with positive uh, feedback and with learning, that's one thing. The other thing is, once you put it on there, you've got to guard it. If you've put things on there on a priority and somebody has a meeting which is clearly a lower priority for you, you got to be tough sometimes. You have to bring yourself to say, I'm sorry, I have a commitment. And some people don't mind saying, I'm sorry, I've got a meeting, even if it's a low priority meeting, because they don't want to let somebody else down. But in a minute, they'll drop their own date with themselves if
Exactly.
anybody asks. So thinking of it as a commitment, giving it a name, anything you name, you take better care of. So maybe you have a project block on your calendar. And then telling anybody who might have access to your calendar, this is very important, and I want you to support me and to remind me and to nag me if that's what it takes. So it's a bit of a project, I think, for most of us. Once we have a calendar that reflects things, and I said breaks before, and I really mean it. Breaks are really important to your creativity, your productivity. But once you have a calendar that reflects all those good things and reflects your choice about how you're going to devote your attention, then you've got to have the game of keeping it going, of filling your commitment.
Yeah, so Cherie said that this is starting her own business 35 years ago, allowed her to have control of her calendar. And she says, take one day a week for yourself and learn to say no, which is exactly what you were just saying. You were giving us some strategies about how to say no.
Yeah.
But we have to be able to do that. And on our team, we often say, sometimes you have to say no to the good so you can say yes to the great. And so that's the thing. By the way, one of the things you just said a minute ago that I was furiously writing down was anything you name, you take better care of. I just love that. That is really, really, really good. So there's calendars. Here's the other one I picked. The other one that I picked was around, and there are 2 or 3 of your 50 ways about this as well. And it's one of these things that people have a love or a hate relationship with: networking. So some people are going to say, Beverly, really, seriously, networking and happy? I don't think so. Tell me how networking can help us find our happy.
Well, first of all, even people who hate networking generally understand that it's good for your career. But I think the way I try to help clients become more comfortable with networking is I call it other things, because somehow the term has gathered some baggage, and people think of their worst experience ever at a cocktail party trying to give a card when nobody wanted them. So, so we want to get rid of the baggage around networking and recognize that it's about relationship. And one of the fundamentals the book talks about is that we are social beings. We are social animals. If you think about our ancestors, thousands of years ago, the hunters and gatherers who knew how to work together, they survived. The loners who wanted to do it themselves, they didn't survive. So we evolved, the survivors evolved with the skill and the need to work with other people. And that happens in all the parts of your life. And often when people are feeling burned out or stuck or just in the doldrums, it's not about, just being tired. Sometimes it's about loneliness. People often feel lonely, but they experience it as anger or frustration or something else. So the first thing to recognize is your relationship with other people is critical to your happiness, no matter where you are. Then the next thing is, how do you get over the fear of reaching out to other people. We all hate it at some level, I think. But the thing is to
even
start
the most
with,
extroverted of us, right? Because what's happening
absolutely.
right now is there's a whole conversation going on in people's head based on where they are on the sort of the introversion, extroversion scale. But I think what the more introverted people need to know is that last thing that you said is really important. That even more extroverted people at some time, at some point, even if it doesn't look like it's true, it's still true. It's hard to reach out and put yourself out.
So imagine yourself in the middle of a series of concentric circles, like a bullseye. You're the bullseye. And the circles are maybe your relationship activity, your social life. And if you're feeling very introverted that day, maybe your comfort zone isn't far out of that bullseye. If you're a big extrovert, maybe you can go out through a few rings and you're still in your comfort zone. But wherever you are, there's a line that you don't feel like crossing. And the trick of taking some of the pain out of networking is learning that you can start wherever you are. You don't have to go far out of the comfort zone. You just have to make the effort to go a little bit beyond where you are. And then the next thing is, one thing that really helps me is reminding myself that kindness can be your guide. I mean, haven't you? You're very socially polished. I know you're great at meeting rooms, but I bet even you have been in meetings or like parties or something where you just felt like nobody wanted to talk to you. They all knew each other. You didn't really have much to contribute to this time.
100%. Yeah,
So
100%.
one thing to do is, or two ideas in that situation. One is to look for people who look even more uncomfortable than you are. There's always somebody in the room who's unhappy about something. And just reaching out to somebody, and it is often kind of the least important person in the room, and important I do in quotes, kind of the lowest ranking for that particular event. Networking is not about going to the most important person. Networking is really about making relationships, seeing a person, and authentically connecting at any place you happen to be. And you start where it's needed sometimes. You start by going to a person who could use your help. And if they reject you, it's not a big deal. You probably never see them again, and it was a very small encounter. So being kind is one thing, but the
Well,
other one,
I'm just going to stop you right there,
yeah.
because if we're kind and if we're doing that the way you just described it, the chances of it going south are really low. And even if they go south, all that really means is that person doesn't really sort of engage with you. So you weren't engaging with them before, so you really haven't lost anything.
Exactly. And another part of this is, if you look at what makes people happy, measurably happy, one of them is when they do a kind act. Gratitude and kindness are two emotions or senses that help you feel more positive. So if you spend a few minutes or the whole evening helping somebody else, you're going to feel much more upbeat. You're going to leave the event or the moment feeling happier than you were when you started.
I agree 100%. Okay, so I picked two. Now it's your turn. What's one of the other 50, or a theme from some of the other 50 that you feel like now that's the one you want to talk about right now?
Well, I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, because there's so much going in the workplace and it's more important than ever, and that is, whenever you don't know what to do in a project, or at a bad day at the office, or in your life, whatever you do, if you can just think of one thing, what can I do? The answer is learn something new. That almost never fails. If you're kind of really bored at your desk, look at what you're doing and see, is there a new element? Is there a new skill? If you put yourself in learning mode, it kind of changes your mindset, and all of a sudden you're noticing things, you're more open to things, you tend to be more creative, and it doesn't have to even be about your work. If you are learning something related to your hobby or something else you want to learn, I tried for years unsuccessfully to learn Spanish, to speak Spanish, but just being in that learning mode, it changes how you function on your regular tasks and you're more creative and innovative.
Yeah, I love that. And we could probably have a whole show just on that. But I promised, I don't very often do this, Beverly, as I sort of gave all of you sort of my roadmap, right? We would talk about this, and then I said we'd talk about us as leaders, because after all, this is the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. As you and I talked about before we went live, that, as leaders, we're also humans. So everything we've just talked about completely applies to us as individuals. But you and I also agree on the fact that this is even perhaps more important for us as leaders. Why is that?
If you are not happy yourself, you're functioning at a lower level. If you're not happy yourself and you're not positive, you're going to be much less effective as a leader, because people are responsive to positive leaders. You're not at your most creative. You may be feeling exhausted. So taking care of yourself and managing the things that you could manage about your own work engagement will make you better able to help other people. It'll also allow you to model the kind of things you talk about, and so show that you really mean it. And as you struggle with your own happiness, your own lack of motivation today, or whatever it is, the more you consciously struggle in managing your own inner self, the better you are at understanding what other people need, and the more empathetic you are as a leader.
That last part is really good. I mean, a lot of people would probably say, well, we're the pebble in the pond, and if we're more positive, that's going to help others around be more positive, which is 100% true. But that other point of, if I'm consciously working on it for myself and I realize that it's work that can be done, then I'm in a better position to help other people. I really, really like that a lot. One of the things you talk about early in the book is the engagement triangle. And
Yes.
Engagement is one of those words, Beverly, that gets a lot of play in the leadership press and in the business world. And so I'd love for you to talk about this engagement triangle a little bit, because I think for people now with their leadership hat on, this will be a useful way for people to think about it. So just in your head, get a triangle in your head.
Yeah.
And Beverly's going to fill this out for you.
Yeah. So the three corners of the triangle are three areas that anybody who's studied leadership knows are very important to employee engagement. One of them is purpose, one of them is people, and one of them is performance. And what I've noticed is that people tend to manage one or two of those, but they often have a blind spot. So when I was working with clients over the years, I created a triangle. And then for each triangle, I would list a bunch of questions, and I'd kind of make almost a ritual of having a discussion about the client. Purpose can be the mission of the organization. Your big purpose could be very value driven, but it could be that you're trying to save money for grad school, or you're raising your family. There are all kinds of ways that purpose matters, but keeping track of your purpose and the purpose of the activity and how they're aligned can just be managing your purpose, even when it's not perfect, can be helpful. We're back to how relationships matter, and purpose is very often related to people. One of the things that makes people happier is knowing how their work is connected to other people. Who are their stakeholders is a question. What's the impact on them? Who might be affected that you're not thinking about? Also, people are an opportunity. Maybe what you're doing gives you an opportunity to network, to build relationships, to do things like that. And then performance gets in the essence of work. When we're really doing great work, it feels very much like play. And we are throwing ourselves into it. At the same time, we have processes that help us frame it so we get the most from all that energy. Purpose includes, sometimes you have to have some grit to keep going when you don't feel like it. It can include using your expertise and building your learning. But I find if leaders, the phrase my clients have used again and again, kind of spontaneously, is do the triangle. They'll say, let's do the triangle. And if they do the triangle with their people, with their team members, it becomes something that collectively you're consciously managing. And you can't think about other people if you haven't also committed to thinking about yourself. Those things tend to happen simultaneously, and a lot of good conversations come out of doing the triangle.
Purpose, people, performance. Thank you for sharing
Mm-hmm.
that. I appreciate that. We are talking with Beverly Jones, the author of the brand new book, Find Your Happy at Work, 50 Ways to Get Unstuck, Move Past Boredom, and Discover Fulfillment. All those in favor, say aye. Okay, so you mentioned it earlier. We talked a little bit about loneliness, and there's some stuff about loneliness in the book, and we talked a little bit about how to get past that. Beyond that, because that seems like an obvious answer to my next question, but in this world that we're living in now, and as we are recording this on the 11th of October, 2021, putting a timestamp on it, we're still in a workplace pandemic sort of scenario, right? Not all organizations have determined their future of work. Not all organizations that have determined it have implemented it yet. So my question would be, what's the implication if you're going to be a remote leader or a remote worker or a hybrid worker moving forward? What's the implication of all of that? And what's your advice to people to find their happy if that's their situation?
Wow, that's a big question. I think when times are changing and everything seems uncertain and we know there are going to be new directions, it's not a bad idea to go to the basics. One of the things is to put yourself into mode of feeling grounded and flexible and those kinds of things. I think taking care of yourself, doing the triangle, but also kind of thinking about your well-being are things that are important. And so once you have the base, then we go back to learning and other people, some of the things we've already spoken about. If you have a varied network, if you have a varied intellectual life, and you're constantly engaging with new ideas and different viewpoints, you're going to thrive. And so as we're going into a situation where maybe we're working remotely for the first time, or we're managing remotely, or we're having to upskill for a new technology related to the new world, that's all very uncertain stuff. But if you have the basics of knowing the importance of committing to relationships and knowing the importance of following the learning path, I think you're going to navigate more easily.
I like that. Thank you for sharing that. So before we sort of move into the last phase, before we go round into the final turn here, is there anything we didn't talk about that we should have? Or is there a question you wished I'd have asked that I didn't?
I think a question that I get a lot is, this sounds like so much. I just don't have time. How can I get started? And in the book, I use a kind of a metaphor that, as a kid, I learned how to drink tea without 3 teaspoons of sugar by like removing 1 grain, like one day, and thinking if I do that the next day and remove 2, I'll learn how to drink tea without sugar. And I did that. And so as I was thinking about change back in those OU days when I was a change leader and I knew nothing about organizational management or pretty much anything, I just told myself, I'm just going to do a sugar grain a day. I'm going to make a sugar grain of change and just keep going. And what I found is if you don't have to do a big sweeping thing, everybody's talking about changing jobs. You're not under pressure to change jobs immediately. What you can do is say, all right, this is the direction I want to go. Maybe I want to work in a way that I'm not so isolated. I'm going to do 1 sugar grain of activity today. I'm going to call 1 friend or whatever it is. So doing things, very tiny steps, really works if you keep it up. And to keep it up, you have to write down what you're going to do probably and track what you've done. So little sugar grains, but keeping track can create huge change when you're afraid of big change all at once.
1% a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
1% a day doesn't take very much to make a big difference, because not only that, it compounds. It's like compound interest, right?
It does.
So Beverly, before we go, I have a couple more questions for you. When you're not writing books and coaching folks and creating podcasts and being on podcasts, what do you do for fun?
Well, I am sitting now and Rappahannock County, Virginia, about 70 miles away from a place. We still have a home in Washington, D.C., but out here we have a farmhouse. We have 43 acres. We have Labrador retrievers. I have a big garden. I walk. I am an outdoor person, and I try to get outside every day. And it's an outdoors kind of culture here. So it's a big change from our Washington, D.C. life, but we spend a lot of time out here now. So that's always fun.
All right, Cherie says this has been very informative. I agree, Cherie, and you're welcome. So I have another question for you, and that is the question that I ask everyone, and it's the only question that you knew I was going to ask you. So what are you reading these days?
I am reading a book by Earl Johnson called Offering Comfort During Hard Times. Earl was the founder and I think the leader of the unit at the American Red Cross that offered comfort to both first responders and victims after horrible situations, psychological and emotional comfort. And his book is about what you can do when people around you are struggling with trauma. And I think we're all surrounded by people these days who are struggling with trauma as leaders. It may be not the kind of trauma that Earl dealt with, which like were shootings and hurricanes and things like that. But
Right.
I think we all know, or maybe we are ourselves, traumatized as a result of the pandemic and all kinds of related stresses. So his book is comforting in that it gives you specific suggestions of what you can do to help other people. And along the way, you learn about how you can kind of take care of yourself a little more. So I recommend that book.
I appreciate you sharing that. I told you ahead of time that the reason that I asked this question, and if you've been watching or listening for a long time, that I do always ask it. And the reason I ask it is for a long time I've had a habit that when I meet interesting, smart people, I like to ask that question as a reader. And it's amazing how often well, it's not amazing. It's so often a book shows up in someone else's, in this conversation that I've never heard of. And sometimes one just seems to, I haven't read this book. I never heard of this book. But I'm just going to say, based on what you said, that this is a book that many of us need to read, because your point about us all dealing with trauma, whether it's stuff related to COVID or whatever else it might be, I think it's tremendously timely. And I really appreciate, Beverly, you sharing it. I got one more thing for you to share. It's the question you really want me to ask you from the beginning. Like, how can we learn more about you, get in touch with you, get a copy of the book, all that stuff? Where do you want to point people?
Well, the starting point, I guess, is my website. It's www.clearways, that's ways with an S, clearwaysconsulting.com. And that has all of my social media and information about the book. And of course, the book is available like all the places that books are sold these days. Wherever your local bookstore is, you can order it. You can order it from all of the big players as well. So, but the website will tell you the details. And thanks for putting it up there. It's always hard to say that S in it.
Clearwaysconsulting.com, everybody.
That's right.
So now I have a question for all of you before we go. And that question is simply this. Now what? What are you going to do with what you just learned? What action are you going to take? Maybe there's a couple of books now that you're going to read. Maybe you learned something about how you can make change happen for yourself or your team with one sugar grain at a time. Maybe you got something to help you think about dealing with loneliness or to think about networking in a new way. I don't know what it is, but I know that if you don't think back, reflect on and say, that's something I'm going to do different because I was here, then it won't be nearly as valuable as it could have been. And I hope that you'll do that. And so Beverly, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
It was
I've been
great.
looking forward to it. I'm so glad we got the chance to do this.
Thank you.
And so, I'm here every week, right? So you all just need to come back. This episode was brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each month, we do bring you a new skill in a masterclass format. You can learn all about it at remarkablemasterclass.com. And we will be back next week right here, both live and on the podcast with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.